So I really liked that setup about imagined futures, because that's so much of what both of these women have focused on in their work. And Lynn, I wanted to start with you, just because some of the themes that you've explored for decades in your art is prescient, to say the least. And I've been thinking about how we as a society talk about the future and the near future and the far off future and all of the limitations in which we sort of imagine what the future means. You know, one of the ways, in the context of AI, there's this sense of like waiting for the killer robots to show up, which is a trope. And I wonder, in so many ways, because the future has arrived and is around us, when you think about even the past 2 decades of your art, what are some of the things that have sort of been realized that are either you knew were coming or have surprised you?
I can't say that I knew what was coming, but you take the tools of your time, and I wanted to make something that was on a computer that you could talk to, and that you could attach a film as kind of an expanded cinema. And I simultaneously was making a film called Technolust about 3 cyborgs, and I had to actually make the film in order to do this thing that was one of the characters. And when I made the film, this was before things became obsolete. So, as they constantly do with media, the program would leap onto your Palm Pilot as you watched the film, so you could talk to the character after. But I think that the tools of our time are there for invention in our time. But it's like an amoeba, it moves slowly. There's a kind of a foot that moves ahead and the rest of it drags. So the dragging part has caught up to where it was 20 years ago, when this whole process was invented, not just with Agent Ruby, but with the Alice bot, and when people started to think about what could be done with that, without thinking also about the malicious elements that would eventually be foisted on this technology by humans, ways to exploit individuals, which is now the next thing that we have to deal with and invent a way out of. So
a thing that you say, Joy, in the film Coded Bias, which everyone should go see, I think the premiere is today, I really highly recommend it. One of the things you say is, the past dwells within our algorithms. And I think this is evocative for so many reasons. I'm curious to hear, just because I think, and it's really helpful to have the clip here, because I know there are people in the audience with all different levels of understanding and familiarity with machine learning and how modeling works. And I wonder if you could just talk briefly to, there's this sense sometimes of blind trust in either math, or our sense that a computer is working in a sort of just abstract, neutral way. And we know just from so many aspects of how we all live that that's not the case. And I wonder if you could speak to your own sense of realizing just how expansive biases, computer-run biases, can be.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to study computer science so I didn't have to deal with the messiness of humanity. Numbers looked like a way to escape that. And as I would work on various projects, I was surprised that the tech wasn't working as well on me as what I had read it to be doing. And so I started looking into, what does computer vision even mean? How do we teach machines to see in the first place? And that's what introduced me to machine learning. So the idea of machine learning is you are learning patterns. So where do you learn these patterns from? Data sets. And so I started looking into data sets, and I encountered many pale male data sets. So some of the most prolific data sets used to train machines to detect human faces might be something like 80% lighter-skinned individuals, 75% male. And so it became clear to me why I was having a different experience than what I was reading from. And so machines were learning from the data. And the data reflected what I call power shadows. So power shadows, who has had the power in the first place to make the technology? And one of the things I saw with the research we were doing is, when we were looking at why we had such a male skew, was that companies would scrape the available data, and sometimes they would do public officials. So who's more likely to hold power? Right, men, right? So you see that. Then with the lighter-skinned individuals, and you're scraping media images, who's represented in the media, right? And so this is where I started seeing the past and the present, right, dwelling within our algorithms.
Right, and so the power shadow is your term for it, right?
Power shadows.
So the power shadows aren't just through the people training the algorithms, but from the data all around us that comes from power structures throughout society.
Absolutely.
Talk about how, watching this clip, Lynn, how this reflects sort of your sense of a minority's place in tech or in tech-adjacent spaces, either as a woman, a person of color, and a woman, how things have changed. Do you have a sense that there is progress, or that we're only just beginning to see how bad it is?
Well, it's funny because somebody said this morning to me, actually it was somebody from a French television company, she might be here, about how I felt about technology being dominated by men. And when you really go back and think about Mary Shelley having predicted artificial intelligence, and Ada Lovelace having written the first code, and Hedy Lamarr having invented spread spectrum technology.
Well, and the first computers were human women, right? Doing computing work. The first computers were actually women doing the work of computing.
Yes, yeah. So, so they were kind of, their genius was, and Rosalind Franklin as well. I have to say that she should still retroactively get her Nobel Prize. That the genius of the women was co-opted by capitalist entities that were run by men. But I think it's changing. I really do. I think that in the last 20 years, there's been a lot of progress, and specifically also in the art world, in that women now who are coming up to their moment of affecting their themselves in the world have internalized a sense of entitlement. And I think that that's great, and that is really what has changed and will change the future in technology and particularly in the art world, where you see women museum directors, women curators, women gallery directors, critics. I mean, in my day, women weren't allowed to show in art museums. And that was only in the 1960s. I guess that is a little ways back there, but still we could remember where absolutely no women were ever allowed.
You look like you had something to add there.
Well, one was the term minority, because one thing I point out with the research is oftentimes in these data sets that center pale males, we're missing the undersampled majority. So if we're talking about women, if we're talking about people of color, if you're talking about companies that have these global aspirations, is this technology meant to work for men in Finland, right? So sometimes I push on the notion of minority, because when I read certain research papers, if it's marginalized, that it's not a big deal, then it seems like, oh, this is a side problem as opposed to something that should have a central focus. And also just in terms of thinking about progress for women, yes, but with women of color, as I think maybe the one or two Black female PhD students, right, in my department at MIT. There's so much more to do and so much further to go.
Yeah, but I think you can't get away with some of the things that became endemic and toxic in our culture. I think it's really shifting because people notice now.
And because people like Joy are doing the work that she's doing, for sure. And I take your point about minority. I think that's an important one. Lynn, you mentioned red squares. I'll set this up just a bit. So, and then this will sort of help inform the rest of our conversation. But the clip that we just saw from Coded Bias, I think, does a really good job of underscoring some of the extent to which people can be made invisible through the flaws of these models. Red square, what I'm calling red squares. This next clip just named it that. So I'm going to start with a big, broad question before we get into the weeds of algorithms. And I want to hear from both of you on this. Did we lose the privacy battle? Is privacy just over? What did we ever have it in the first place? But it seems like societally we've gotten to a point where, as this clip underscored so effectively, that the data that's being collected about us, even if we're rigorous about opting out, is just beyond our control now. So privacy, over? Illusion?
I think that my generation may have been the last one to have ever experienced it, and know that it was there. But I do think that things are changing because, the heinous development of ownership of individuals and then profiting from it has caused now the awareness of people of what has been wrought. And it's just recently that we've come to understand this. So there are states that are changing the law in Texas and Illinois. Texas has had something on their books for a long time, strangely enough, and Illinois just passed one, and California is trying to pass one where you own your face. And they are trying to actually make this stronger than this, and there are many people that are trying to machine wrench the machine, to monkey wrench the machine and shift privacy-backed ownership to individuals. And I think this is something we have to really insist on.
I want to go back to this concept of owning your face, but first I want to hear from Joy.
Well, even as you're talking about regulations, right, GDPR Article 9 gives you privacy rights.
Tell folks, just give a little bit of context in case.
Sure, general data privacy regulation. The EU is like, all this data, all this oil, we might want some privacy rights. Go Europe. So they actually implemented a law. Right, so how it's being executed is another question, but Article 9 specifically says if you have data that's being taken about your demographics, or if you have biometric data like your face profile being taken, you actually have privacy rights over that. And so I think the danger is the assumption we can do nothing. And that's part of why we started the Algorithmic Justice League, to say people have a voice and a choice. You saw in the example here, the Brooklyn tenants, in Coded Bias, we show them protesting the installation of a facial recognition system, and the landlord ended up retracting it, right? So we don't have to accept the surrender of our faces or the harvesting of our data as a de facto. We do have to push back, or it will become a de facto.
And a bit of context on the apartment complex that she just referenced is a place in Brooklyn where, and either of you jump in with additional context if you like, but where the tenants were, it was suggested that they would switch their keys out for a facial recognition system. They would occasionally receive notices under their doors, sort of like citations for either misbehavior of some kind, maybe being too loud, that would show pictures of them in the hallway. So just really profound surveillance. And pushing the boundaries of what we have considered acceptable in terms of what a tenant would be able to, or a landlord would be able to do to its tenants. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, what was interesting is when I went to meet the Brooklyn tenants, it wasn't that they had replaced the key fobs. They still had to use their key fobs, and they had to use their faces. And they were talking to other tenants. It was actually a different apartment complex that had largely Asian residents. And what would happen is they would wait for one person whose face would be detected, so then they could all come in afterwards.
So like taking one for the team, and then everybody just goes in.
In some countries, though, it goes beyond that, even goes to your DNA, with their biometric reading. And in some countries where they don't let certain sects participate in going to particular places, and if there's been any kind of intermarriage, it will show up in your DNA. So by having you put a biometric fingerprint on something, you could be locked out of many places.
Well, and facial recognition, it seems to have been normalized both of you tell me maybe the past 5 years. I know now iPhones have an unlock feature where you just show your face. And I wonder to the extent, there was a big story in the New York Times last week, I believe, that talked about the use by law enforcement agencies of these vast databases of really effective models of where the reporter basically Cash Hill wrote about how she could cover her nose and mouth and the system would still recognize her and then pull up pictures from a decade ago. And so I'm curious, it seems like it's now all around us in a way that it wasn't even 5 years ago.
Yeah, well, one, I would say effective for who and effective for what. So if you have accuracy disparities across a range of groups, but even if it's perfectly accurate, right? Now we have the mass surveillance state tracking every movement. What's been fascinating for me to see with police use of facial recognition was this Georgetown Law report that came out in 2016, the perpetual lineup. It showed 1 in 2 adults, more than 130 million people in the US had their face in a face recognition network that could be searched unwarranted using algorithms that hadn't been audited for accuracy. With Clearview AI, we're seeing what a startup is able to do. So imagine what governments are doing. Imagine what intelligence
And Clearview AI
agencies-
is this from the article I referenced.
Yes. So Clearview is a startup that said, wait, you have your Facebook photo and your real name? Wonderful. Let's just get that data. Nothing stops us from doing so. Or even if the terms of policy stop us from doing so, we can still do it anyways. And now let's sell it to police. And so the police can say, well, here's this blurry image. Let's search online. Oh, here's an Instagram photo. The one that really got me was somebody was detected from a reflection of somebody else's gym photo, right? So it's not as if
It was
you're
accurate. It was actually them.
I do believe in that particular case. So there are cost of inclusion, cost of exclusion. Sometimes it's accurate, sometimes it's inaccurate. But either way, I keep saying face the final frontier of privacy.
Well, in your work, I wonder if you can talk about, Joy, the tension, if you feel tension, between knowing that staying invisible might actually, I mean, certainly it's unjust that people with darker skin wouldn't be recognized by these models that have potentially really beneficial use, but have there ever been moments where you've sort of thought, like, maybe I don't want the machines to see me?
I was like, that white mask wasn't the worst thing, you know, mass surveillance state and so forth. So I often have that tension within my work. And for example, when you're looking at computer vision, the same kind of techniques that are used to detect a face can be modified to detect a body, pedestrian tracking. So you also have research coming out, right, that shows with pedestrian tracking, your height makes a difference. So it's not as accurate with shorter people. Think children, right? Or short people like me. I'm under 5'2". But, and then also darker skinned individuals in that context, or people who are differently abled. And so there's so much ableism that's built in within computer vision models and understanding of the world. And so here it's to be seen under what terms, right? So you having agency and control is a major component of it. So sometimes I want to be seen, sometimes I don't, but do I have that decision? And right now, the architectures we have for AI and machine learning assume that we just have to accept the surrender of our data and the surrender of our privacy, but those are design choices.
And you know, these laws are being changed, and there's attempt now with a California law that people are trying to put into place. It's being constantly challenged by major companies. However, all government entities are exempt. So
And this is the law modeled off of GDPR. Is it something else?
it's something new
Okay.
that was just developed by a tech entrepreneur that hired a number of lawyers to write something.
Interesting. So I want to give some examples. You talked about having agency over the data that's collected. So I want to give some examples of the ways in which data is used, you know, to determine what credit you might get. We know that there have been examples of hiring software that recommends men disproportionately in an unfair way. There were reports when the Apple Card came out that married couples with shared finances for years, that the man would be given a higher spending limit. Just doing a Google image search of the term CEO will return a lot of men. And to your point earlier, part of that reflects, at least in that case, the world, because maybe there are more male CEOs. But I wonder if we could talk a little bit about, you referenced sort of taking control of the algorithm or being able to choose when and how to be seen. And I'm curious if that starts with a way of looking at algorithms that projects the future as it should be, or how do you think about changing these models? I mean, good data is one, but in the case of the Google image CEO example, where the world actually is full of more male CEOs, how do we find the balance between reflecting the world as it is and then correcting for what we would hope it might be?
Well, the first question is, should this model exist? And oftentimes, particularly with somebody with computer science training and an engineering mindset, it's let's solve it, right? So let's optimize it. So let's optimize the facial recognition that's put on the lethal autonomous weapon that's now detecting you, weaponized AI, but it's accurate.
Killer robots.
Right? Or you might not have killer robots, the sentient beings. You might have really dumb robots that don't detect you on the car. And either way, the end result is the same, right? And so for me, what has shifted as I've gone through this journey of establishing the Algorithmic Justice League is not just focusing on how do we make objectively, quote unquote, better models, but what kinds of systems do we want and what kind of systems don't we want, which oftentimes isn't even included in the conversation, but there need to be strict categorical bans for the kinds of tech that are out there.
Talk a little bit more, if you would, about what the Algorithmic Justice League does, because it sounds very superhero, and she is wearing Wakanda earrings. So I would love to hear more about the specific kind of work you're doing.
Right, so the Algorithmic Justice League, we combine art and research to illuminate the social implications of AI. The art part, you saw we have Coded Bias, the film that's coming out, but we also have art exhibitions. There's a spoken word poem called AI, Ain't I a Woman, where we pose Sojourner Truth's 19th century question to 21st century algorithms. And so the whole component is to make sure people are aware that AI isn't neutral. We've arrived in the age of automation, overconfident and underprepared, and it's up to us to do something. We also do academic research on algorithmic bias. So our two blockbuster papers showed large racial bias and gender bias in AI systems sold by IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon. And then we also do advocacy work, right? And so congressional hearings, state hearings, but using research-backed recommendations to inform what policy can look like going forward. And so that's the Algorithmic Justice League, ajlunited.org if you want to become an agent. The Wakanda earrings are not yet available, but we're working on it.
You mentioned the companies that you've given recommendations to or shared your data with, and one of the things that's interested in Coded Bias is you talk about the reaction from different companies. Can you speak to that for a bit? Sort of what do big tech companies, when confronted with the reality of their flawed data?
Absolutely. So we've had a range of responses from no response to we're improving our models, and then the response that I had anticipated but came later was a company actively trying to discredit our research. And so Amazon, when we released our latest research showing recognition for gender classification, surprise, surprise, had bias like everybody else in the industry, attempted to say we made false conclusions, et cetera. This was peer-reviewed MIT research, but it was co-authored by two African American women, right? And we did not look like the experts. So they had two Amazon VPs trying to they hadn't even read the paper. So we're actually upset that they didn't have solid intellectual arguments against the paper.
Didn't they like define computer vision in a nonsensical way or something?
We were laughing. Yeah, I think I don't know if they cut this from the film, but you see all of us like just chuckling at the way Amazon tried to discredit. But this is the importance of allies. And so we actually had a Turing Prize winner, so the Nobel Prize for Computer Science, who pioneered many of the techniques that are being used for AI now, come out in support of our research. And we had more than 70 AI researchers say, no, this is good research. And in fact, if we want to move forward, we have to grapple with these issues. So I was really heartened to see the research community step up and support us, but it also just showed me how much power Amazon had.
I'm sorry, please go ahead. Well, one of the things you mentioned earlier, Lynn, was the shift in influence from a time before these tech companies, often male-run, sort of took control of the models we're building in many ways. And I wonder, a thing that I've been thinking about a lot with algorithms is the extent to which, I've been thinking a lot for a while about algorithmic transparency and whether that's possible, and I want to get to that too. But whether there could ever be sort of like a citizen's algorithm. So instead of an algorithm that's in service to Facebook's incentives, for example, could we have an algorithm that's in service to what we want to do as citizens of a liberal democracy? And I just wonder if that's even the right way to think about it, or?
Well, I think it's probably always useful, and I think that artists are optimists and set out kind of hopeful waves of ways that a culture can move towards democratic means and a safe means to deal with their privacy, their personal identity. However, I remember when I first started to do some of these projects, and I showed it to Marilyn Manson because I thought, isn't this great? We could do this. He said, just wait 3 years until it's co-opted. And I thought, how it'll never happen. And of course, it always is. So, but I think that sending out the optimistic ways of redesigning things as they exist into examples and ideas of what is possible is always a good idea.
Joy, you talked about thinking through the models we want to build and the models we don't. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, I was just thinking of this term, and I'm thinking of the work of Dr. Ruha Benjamin. She has this book, Race After Technology. I'm thinking of some of the work of Sasha Kostanzichuk, has a new book out, Design Justice, which is this notion of algorithms of liberation, right? And in your earlier piece that we showed, you were showing the red boxes, the red squares, right? And it reminded me of this project called the White Collar Crime Map. And so what they did was, okay, instead of what kind of crimes do we want to map? If we map financial crimes, right, the target areas, right, it's going to be downtown Manhattan, these financial centers. And so they flipped the predictive model on its head to say, what assumptions are you making? And then they also had an average face of who would be likely to commit this kind of crime. So shifting what you're creating and the assumptions behind those creations can make a huge difference.
One question I have, this opens a whole nother can of worms, but as we're trying to build models for good, what about malicious actors? So especially on the internet, just thinking about the extent to which people could try to skew data for other forms of gain outside of the framework of a tech company just trying to make a profit, like all of the ways that data can be misused maliciously.
Yeah, and I think that's really one of the more perverse things that happen, because what's known as algorithmic violence is something that takes away your rights to your own profile and your civil rights. And
well, so elaborate on that concept just for a second when you say algorithmic violence.
For instance, if you have algorithms that are coded to look in low-income districts, non-white districts, and send police to arrest people before crime happens, which is happening now. This predictive policing came out, maybe 5 years ago. Now it's all over the world, including, China, Korea, UK, all over the United States, because they say it cuts down on crime. But what it does is it arrests many people who are non-white and puts them, into prison without them having done anything. If you are from from an area, living in an area that has a zip code of a non-affluent place of residence, you have an algorithm that gives you a negative score. So if you're applying for a home loan, if you're applying for a loan to get an education, which could keep you, which would elevate your status and get you out of a low-income neighborhood, you're turned down most often. And even worse is you don't know it's happening, and you don't know if false information is out there because you can't check it.
So I was going to ask as a follow-up, which I think this is the direction you're headed, is if we can't opt out of the systems, like applying for a loan to buy a home, for example, that are potentially flawed, is the answer to just get full transparency of how your data is being used? And is that even possible?
Not possible. I really don't think it's possible. People don't want you. I just don't think. That's what we have to fight.
Giant data
right now.
brokers that we just don't even know
it's
what they have on us.
Yeah.
And also transparency is not enough, right? We can know there's structural inequality, and we can understand what leads to structural inequality, but we also need to have some way to take action. And so one part is really this notion of algorithmic hygiene, right? Where you are continuously monitoring what's going on within systems and have mechanisms for redress. So it's one thing to make an automated decision. It's another thing to have insight into a decision was made in the first place. And so we need to know where these systems are showing up. For example, with HireVue, they were doing video interviews, and on your video interview as a candidate, they say we collect over 50,000 data points, right? So we can analyze your facial expressions, we can analyze your tone of voice, and that can inform our hiring decision based on the current top performers in a firm. So if those top performers might be largely homogeneous and you don't fit those characteristics, it's not necessarily that you're not qualified for the job, but you don't fit that model. So there's now a law, Illinois keeps leading on the laws, right? But they have a law where it says if you have that kind of system there, you have to let people know it's being used and also have some kind of mechanism for redress.
Well, and then there's the issue of all of these models potentially drawing connections that we don't have a window into. So perhaps being able to say like, oh, this certain facial expression is correlated with a higher propensity for anxiety or depression. And then companies are maybe discriminating against people for their mental health.
Well, you already have this with emotion classification where they ran it on NBA players, and the black NBA players who looked like they had neutral faces were said to have a negative affect, right? And so then if you have behavioral analysis, or maybe have resting bitch face, like whatever it is, right? But it's not necessarily the external expression saying what's happening internally. So you can make all kinds of nefarious inferences and hide under scientific objectivity.
And codes in description, you have to realize, are written by people who are brought up in particular culture and carry with them the biases of that culture, whether they know it or not. And most often also even the facial recognition, particularly the Chinese facial recognition everybody's talking about, are wrong. And so the information goes, I mean, for instance, if they scan a crowd because they want to see what they're wearing so they could sell something to them and get the wrong information constantly, so there's much to change.
And I did want to touch on this notion of algorithmic violence because I've been thinking of FML, failed machine learning, failing freedom, money, love. And so on the money side, being denied economic opportunity. So it could be HireVue saying, oh, your facial expression, you're not good for the job. But there was a case with Uber where trans drivers were being kicked out of the system because they were verifying for fraud, right? And the faces were changing. And so now you're being denied economic opportunity because of the way a system has been developed. And there's no way to contest it, right? That's convenient, So these people ended up having to go to the headquarters, et cetera, and so forth.
Well, there was an artwork that Trevor Paglin and Kate put out where they let coders know how biased the codes were, and they did have, I think, over a million things taken off.
Oh, that was for the ImageNet data set in particular, and they had horrible kinds of descriptions. Like they could look at your face and you might get a label like whore just on somebody's face. And so this was really important because ImageNet is one of the largest data sets for computer vision in general. So that means many of the AI systems in computer vision are inheriting all of these biases. So if you go to excavating.ai, they have a great overview of the history of ImageNet and how the politics of classification get within computer vision systems.
I want to get back later to some of the ways that we can address. We've talked sort of about it from the addressing the modeling standpoint. I want to get back to the sort of legislative side of addressing these issues later. But first, I want to talk a bit about at the individual level. So for people who are concerned about all of these different flaws in various models around us. We all talked before coming up here about how none of us will have an Alexa in our house or use Siri. But I wonder, is it just from an individual standpoint, do you just resist the technology that you feel like encroaches on your privacy and know that you can't, maybe can't opt out entirely? Or how should individuals think about existing in this world?
I don't think that most individuals really understand how much of their life is has been co-opted, and how much information is out there. We just did this little installation where people put their email out, and it spewed all kinds of things about those people that is on the internet. People have the same names. Information is confused. People were shocked at what was there. You know, from their social security number to their credit cards to where they live to how to get in touch with them. I mean, there's enormous, megatons of loose information about everybody, most of it being false. So, at this point, I think that the real task is to figure out how this can be contained so that it doesn't go into our digital DNA and becomes an inheritance for many generations to come.
Well, and art is clearly one way to get people to care. What are the other ways? Because I find, formerly as a tech reporter, I would write a lot about these issues and kept talking to people who said, most people just don't care. And most people are happy to trade free Facebook service for just giving all of their data without thinking about it.
They will care when they know about it. They just don't know about it.
No, I would absolutely agree. And one of the things I keep coming back to is the power of art and the power of storytelling. So as I was doing research on algorithmic bias and talking about performance metrics, it was once I got to performance art, right, using spoken word, where I asked, can machines ever see my queens as I view them? Can machines ever see our grandmothers as we knew them? We talk about the history of the women who've been erased. Ida B. Wells, data science pioneer, hanging facts, stacking stats on the lynching of humanity, and showing how the collection of that data has resonance for how we do data science and who's omitted, who's included. And so my thought is art is the most important part in terms of humanizing what's happening, and that's part of what we're doing with coded bias.
I mean, I made a film that showed here maybe 5 or 6 years ago called Strange Culture. It was that film that the protagonist, Steve Kurtz will tell you, got a 23-year sentence released because that film played all over the world, and there's enough attention about the criminal injustice to him that was going on with nobody challenging it. And I think art is a powerful weapon that we need to use.
And complementing the art, also the collective action. So we've seen in San Francisco, San Francisco, in Oakland, and Brookline, and Cambridge, and other areas, people mobilizing for bans of facial recognition with government use or police use, or putting facial recognition on body cams. And so collective action is being taken. People have a voice. People have a choice. It's not inevitable.
One thing that's interesting to me is that all of this, meaning the rise of mass surveillance and facial recognition, the erosion of privacy, is happening against this cultural backdrop of a decline of faith in institutions, a decline of appreciation for objective truth and Enlightenment values, and that seems like not a coincidence to me. And I wonder how you think about sort of the larger cultural moment and sort of whether that's causal or you mentioned body cams, for example, and we've seen the extent to which they were sort of billed to citizens as police body cams as being a mechanism for protecting sort of the truth of what's happened. And in some cases, some really striking cases, that's been true. In other cases, just because of either the angle or the limited context or what the public was ever able to see, it has a sort of obfuscation. And so what does truth mean in a moment when the models on which we base reality are themselves flawed?
Well, in terms of thinking about truth, when I look at computer science and how I learned about AI, there's this notion of ground truth, which is we can say, this is what a face looks like, right? That's the ground truth. This is what's positive, this is what's negative, and then starting to look into who gets to decide the truth. So now my question is, who gets to define the parameters of the future? Who gets to define the parameters of society? in terms of, is this moment unique? I think the most privileged are now having to grapple with what the marginalized have long been grappling for. And so when I see people concerned about the future of AI, particularly sentient beings, it's not that the marginalized in society, there will be further inequalities, it's that we now might become the marginalized by our own creations. And so for me, that's just a switch, and it just shows the power asymmetries in the first place. So if we're in a moment where the truth seems shaky, I think it's because the truth seems shaky for those who felt they had the power to define the truth in the first place.
That's a really good point. Lynn, did you have something to add?
No, I can't beat that.
Very well said.
Completely.
Well, one of the questions I wanted to ask you is how you remain optimistic in this moment, and I think perhaps your
I wear yellow.
right. That works too. Yellow helps. In addition to a sunny fashion sensibility, but knowing that the power structures are shifting must be one of the sources for optimism in an otherwise very complicated world.
I mean, for instance, in Berkeley, there are hundreds of biohacker basement labs flourishing and popping up because these young people have inherited a diseased planet and diseased future, and they want to cure it so that they could have a decent life. So, I mean, I was really heartened to see how many of these young kids, some with degrees, some without degrees, are using the latest technologies in order to find solutions to some of the problems that we caused them.
One of the themes that keeps coming up here is agency and sort of building the future, the models as we need them to exist, making sure we don't build the ones that will be harmful. I think also this sense of who owns the code is one of the lines that comes up in Coded Bias. And because of the enormous power of these tech companies, it's something like 9 tech companies, 6 of which are in the US, 3 of which are in China, are building sort of the dominant algorithms that shape our life or in charge of sort of the future of AI. Who does own the code, and is there any way to wrest that out of the control of these enormously powerful companies that are now owning it?
I think you could subvert it. I think you can have
How?
I mean, like Francis Tsang, who did that map that gives you you put in your zip code, tells you the white collar crime, and he has a number of projects just like that. And I think there's going to be an encrypted underground that is going to spawn all kinds of disasters on people who think that they own the code and are, as I said, monkey wrenching the machine. I think is kind of the logo that they live with.
So the hackers will save us.
Yeah. Well, let's hope so. Let's hope there'll be enlightened young people who understand what's going on and are dedicated to creating a less biased future with more opportunities.
And towards that end, we just did a project with the Algorithmic Justice League with Boston Public Library and local teenagers called Drag versus AI. And we had a local drag queen come and work with the students where we were dragging the system, CISTEM, and looking at face surveillance and not just how it works, right, but how it can be subverted individually, but also we don't have the capacity to subvert every system individually, so it's ultimately driving towards collective action. And we were doing the project also with ACLU Massachusetts, and they have the Press Pause campaign that's going on. But this whole notion of making sure people are aware, because you can have this narrative that no one cares. It's like, I didn't care because I didn't know you were snatching my face, right? But now that I do, we want to resist.
ACLU all across America is really dealing with these issues.
This idea of subversion is interesting to me too, because we also see it on the sort of in the hands of the powerful. So I'm thinking about across society, the people who will call truth lies, the people who will call, sort of invoke free speech in ways that are not applicable just for their own political or personal gain, and even the extent to which sort of the earlier internet utopian open society, data should be free, sort of that ethos being subverted into, that's why Facebook operates the way it does, for example. So like there is this Orwellian way of kind of using these terms that mean something for the purpose of these giant companies getting what they want or justifying the way that they act. But what you said about the hackers or the people who are going to subvert the system or throw the monkey wrench in, it does invoke this early internet ethos, and I wonder if you see a return to that, or if it's just an evolution of sort of the more idealistic view of what we thought the web would enable or these AI would enable.
I don't see it as a return. I mean, I see it kind of as concentric. So it's going back to some of the original optimism, you know, because it's more serious now, and the younger people are born into this language and know it best, and are finding new ways to create a life for themselves that that's more acceptable. So they're not going back, but they are using that very naive optimism, and I think that the optimism that's going on now is not naive.
Some of the other solutions that come up in this conversation, earlier you mentioned the own your own face, this concept of owning your own face. And I wonder if we could talk about that for a moment, especially Joy, in the context of your work. You've thought so much about facial recognition. What does it mean, just in a setting aside sort of the legislative piece of it, what does it mean for a person to own their own face?
It's to have voice and choice, to have consent, so that somebody can't just take your face and do whatever they want with it. There was, when we were doing the Drag versus AI fashion show, we interviewed the participants, and one of the participants made this observation. She said, well, the age of consent for sex is 16, but they can just take your face, right? You know, as an observation, right? But the sense of this is mine and it can't just be violated without my consent, without my permission.
Right, so like data gathering as a form of not just objectification or commodification, but, you know, it's, I mean, yeah, it's...
I mean, you could do some superficial things to scramble the code, you know, cosmetics or a scarf, but I think, you know, that is just a superficial temporary solution. We really need to go underneath that and do some major strategical revisions.
Yeah, but I will say on the adversarial fashion side, one of my favorite research papers ever, if you're into research papers, it's called Accessorized to Crime. And what they did is, because many computer vision systems that focus on face recognition are trained on celebrity faces, they created glasses where they could switch the frames. So I have these big frames. They could put a particular pattern, so you would be picked up as another person, right? And generally a celebrity. But to your point, this is not going to evade the surveillance state, right? There has to be structural changes towards that.
Right, there's also like paint, Dazzle paint that has worked, but no, of course, it's not
Adam
structural.
Harvey's great on CV Dazzle, yes.
Right. One of the other solutions or possible solutions that comes up in coded bias is this idea of using the constitutional right to due process more broadly applied to some of the encroachment on data. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that, or even like the right to be forgotten, or just some of the other sort of legislative movements that you think are worth people dwelling on a bit.
Yes, so when we think about facial recognition, we can think about the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, and the 14th Amendment. So you're getting at the 14th Amendment with due process. Do you even know that these systems have been used in the first place? Because if you haven't, there is no opportunity for due process. An example of this is facial recognition being used in the criminal justice context, where you have a digital witness that's been used by the police to say you're guilty of this crime, but when you go to court, you're not told that a face recognition system was used at all, right? So that is a violation of the 14th Amendment when we're thinking about due process. When we're thinking about the Fourth Amendment, right? So you have to have a warrant to search. When you have mass surveillance, there is no warrant to search your face, right? And then if we think about the First Amendment, and we think about the chilling effects, right? Maybe I don't want you to, I was laughing because I was watching, this is what I do in my free time. I watch congressional hearings on facial recognition. So I was watching one a few weeks ago, and there was one Republican representative saying, so you're saying if I went to a gun show and they had face recognition, they could pick me up? I was like, yes. And then the other person who was who was actually there was saying the same technology that was deployed at the Freddie Gray protest, right, to scan people for their faces is the same thing that could be deployed at a gun show. And so there is a coalition opportunity here with people from many different viewpoints, and you've actually seen that within the US, where there's bipartisan support to do something about facial recognition technologies, either from a privacy perspective, we don't want to be China perspective, or civil rights, civil liberties perspective.
I wonder if this has ever gone to the Supreme Court, because, for instance, you cannot in the United States use a human cell for any kind of genetic research. You can't use it, you can't CRISPRize it, or you can in almost every other country. And the reason this was taken to the Supreme Court, and they said that you couldn't, because of the 13th Amendment, because if you use a cell of a human, then it's slavery. So why isn't a digital image of a human slavery?
Interesting, right? So the digital representation, what
Yeah.
does that?
It's the same thing.
Yeah.
Right?
I haven't heard that one before.
one?
You also mentioned the First
My
Amendment.
film.
You also mentioned the First Amendment, and I'm curious for both of your views on the right to be forgotten, which is, well, I'll leave it there. Tell me what you think of how it's deployed in Europe as well. Like, do you think it's a good thing? Does it work?
Yeah, again, I think it comes back to agency. I want to be visible to get that discount, maybe, but I don't want to be visible to be oppressed, right? So I do think it comes back to agency, choice, and control, and it also comes back to design decisions. So when we hear the narrative from large tech companies, this is the way it is, and then you see, but when a law is passed, for example, in Canada, Facebook had this app called Moments, but because Canada had a law on biometrics that said the private sector had to obtain consent, they didn't deploy it in Canada. When GDPR came out and y'all got those updates because people didn't want to have to change it for each different locations, it does show that there's actually a choice in the design. Facebook, they keep going back and forth, but they recently made it where obtaining your face print, your unique biometric data from your face, was opt-in. And it's like, wait, it was opt-out in the first place, which is part of the problem.
In terms of how we interact with various services, especially social media, I think is an interesting one. Are there things that you do or that you counsel your friends to do that you think most people aren't thinking about and should be, either from a facial recognition or data collection standpoint?
I don't think that you can actually. I've talked to many people, and there's so many ways. If you go through a turnstile, if you go to an ATM, that your information is confiscated. That if you could do as a simplistic gesture, let's say you're not going to put an image on Facebook, but it's going to get there. It's going to get into a database anyway. But I do think that we need a more dynamic undercutting of what the entire system is doing.
So even if you boycott social media and don't go on it, you have to recognize that your face is being collected without your consent.
It might make you feel better, but it's not going to help.
Well, as someone who studies facial recognition, I don't use Face ID. I have the little. I'm paranoid in the first place, so there's that. After being attacked, but I think what can be problematic is if you take those individual steps and you don't do the larger structural change that is necessary, because Facebook tomorrow can say, never mind, it's opt-in again or opt-out, et cetera, for how they're collecting your face data.
And does structural change, to vastly oversimplify, if you had to boil it down, start with putting the right people in positions of power so we can build the future we need to?
Well, I would say when I think about structural change for what it would look like to move towards more equitable and accountable AI, there are three key areas. One, affirmative consent. So people actually have a voice and a choice with what's happening. The other is meaningful transparency. Not just that the system is being used, but how is it being used? What are the known limitations and capabilities? Where are these data trails going? You have a lot of dirty data out there, dirty data colonialism, all kinds of things. And then the most important part is continuous oversight, so that there are actually ways of seeing when these systems go wrong and taking corrective action as it's evolving, because the space is continuing to change.
You just used, I think, the term data colonialism. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, so after you were asking if I had tensions with my research, so I do the paper gender shades. We do skin type. bias, and we show many of these data sets don't have many dark-skinned individuals. So then I read about a Chinese company providing facial recognition to the government of Zimbabwe in exchange for something highly valuable, the dark-skinned faces of their citizens. And so you had the physical extraction of African bodies into other kinds of power networks, and now you have the digital extraction of darker skinned individuals to then go to China. So this is an example of what I mean with data colonialism, or even when you saw Cambridge Analytica, right? They were experimenting in Kenya, and other places before they got to the US.
I'm going to ask a big question, and then we'll go to your questions. And that is, this is just sort of like basic AI, but I'm really curious for what you both think. What is it that still defines human intelligence rather than artificial intelligence? Like, what is it about human intelligence that still makes us different? And is there ever a point at which there is a distinction?
It's illogical. Humans don't make any sense. So that's how I know something's not real, is because it's too clear and it's too obvious. When something's crazy, and that's why we need artists. Is when you know that there's some kind of a deeper question. It's an intuitive thing that just jumps over what is expected.
How about for you? I mean, and I'm thinking that was a much more sophisticated answer. I was thinking even more in the terms of like, a computer can now beat us at chess. They could make art. They can do all of these things that we previously associated.
No, they can't.
Oh, fair. Okay. So maybe that's the final frontier. But what do you think? What is it that makes human intelligence, or is there anything that computers won't ever approach? Perhaps it's art.
I think about it for humans who have been, when we dehumanize others, right? How did we justify slavery? How did we do all of these other things where somebody becomes dehumanized and you say they're less intelligent because of these things? So when I think of intelligence, my question is, who's defining what intelligence means in the first place? So if intelligence is a chess game, right, it's going to be a very narrow understanding, and who gets included in that definition. So for me, it is who gets to define what's intelligence, and something we touch on in the film Coded Bias, premiering tonight. I'm so excited, world premiere, yay, is this concept of vulnerability. And that vulnerability makes us human. And so often when we're trying to build AI systems, in some ways we're trying to make them invulnerable or somehow flawless or infallible. And to your point, right, that is the human side of it. And do you call it intelligence? I don't know if intelligence is quite the right word, but it's the human aspect.
AI doesn't have a sense of humor either.
Not a good one.
Yeah.
A lot of humans also don't, I've found.
Fair.
But welcome that, I would say.
I have a 2-minute piece. Is that too long? It's fine.
Go for it.
Okay.
Do you want to stand up, possibly? Is that okay?
I wish I had a visual element, but I might ad-lib what you'd see behind me. My heart smiles as I bask in their legacies, knowing their lives have altered many destinies. In her eyes, I see my mother's poise. In her face, I glimpse my auntie's grace. In this case of deja vu, a 19th century question comes into view. In a time when Sojourner Truth asked, "Ain't I a woman?" And then we show Google labeling Sojourner Truth as a clean-shaven old man. Today, we pose this truth to new powers, making bets on artificial intelligence, hope towers. The Amazonians peek through windows blocking deep blues as faces increment scars. Old burns, new urns, collecting data chronicling our past, often forgetting to deal with gender, race, and class. Again, I ask, ain't I a woman? Face by face, the answers seem uncertain. Young and old, proud icons are dismissed. Can machines ever see my queens as I view them? Can machines ever see our grandmothers as we knew them? Ida B. Wells, data science pioneer, hanging facts, stacking stats on the lynching of humanity, teaching truths hidden in data, each entry and omission, a person worthy of respect. Shirley Chisholm, unbought and unbossed, the first Black Congresswoman, but not the first to be misunderstood by machines well-versed in data-driven mistakes. Michelle Obama, unabashed and unafraid to wear her crown of history. Yet her crown seems a mystery to a system unsure of her hair. A wig, a bouffant, a toupee, maybe not. Are there no words for our braids and our locks? The sunny skin and relaxed hair make Oprah the first lady. Even for her face well known, some algorithms falter, echoing sentiments that strong women are men. We laugh, celebrating the successes of our sisters with serena smiles. No label is worthy of our beauty.
Thank you. I'd love to stay here all day. We're running out of time. Thank you both so much for being here. And thank you, all of you.